Is there a future where Blender costs money? I mean, on their site, they say it'll be free and open source forever, but is that true? I've always just taken it at face value, but I've had tons of comments that think Blender will be paid by 2030. So I'm making this video to prove them wrong. Blender will never cost money. But to understand why, I want to play devil's advocate, because there are some genuinely good points that people will go to prove Blender's instability. The most common being their lack of funding. At BlenderCon last year, Ton Roosendaal asked for something.
And that is money, right?
This is a topic that has never been addressed so openly, and it was the entire platform of his keynote address. He highlighted the fact that users of Thunderbird, another open source software, donated 5 times as frequently as Blender users, which has led Blender to only receive donations from 10,200 of its 3 million users in 2023. And as Blender continues to develop and add more features like simulation nodes, new modeling features, and more speed and reliability for old ones, it needs more funding, especially since it's competing with Autodesk and to other large companies that generate billions of dollars every year, which left people asking the question, what would Blender be willing to do to get that extra funding? If Blender charged money for each update, they wouldn't have to rely on unstable donations or corporate sponsors who have their own agenda and desires for what Blender should be. So when Ton Roosendaal said this,
Money is also getting important in Blender if we want to continue our growth.
many people imagined a world where Blender costs money. I mean, if they charged $100 a month with 3 million monthly users, they would go from $3 million to $3.6 billion per year. Now, on the surface, some of these arguments seem logical, but they are built on fallacies, false assumptions, and riddled with holes. It has just enough truth to seem legitimate, but it completely misjudges Blender's goals, integrity, and the man who created it. For example, Blender could absolutely benefit from more funding. They would be able to hire more developers and could actually build everything they set out to. In his talk, Ton asked,
Why is Blender always promising things and then we don't deliver, right?
and ultimately his answer was money. So check that box. Blender's need for funding is definitely real. But would they be willing to sacrifice the community that they built for a quick cash grab? And illegally, would they even be allowed to do so?
I'm going to think about the mission statement. Why are we here? What are we doing? When I'm not here, maybe I retire one day, or when I die, it should be super clear what Blender is.
This clip gives us a glimpse into the mind of Ton Roosendaal, because ultimately every single reason why Blender will be free forever comes back to him. He first created Blender in January of 1994, and later that year he described it as the magical ability to create a whole world in a computer, which is something he fell in love with, but he loved it so much that he wanted to share it with others, ultimately giving rise to his vision, the mission that drove him throughout the early days of Blender, to give everyone free access to world-class software so that they could have that magic of creation. But making a world-class program costs millions of dollars, money Ton didn't have. So he started looking for investors in his new company, Not a Number. He was able to fund a booth at SIGGRAPH, a computer conference in LA, which resulted in 2 rounds of investments, ultimately totaling $5.5 million.
So yeah, I got an investor on board for $5.5 million.
Finally, Ton had the money to realize his vision for Blender. But in early 2002, Not a Number shut down, leaving Blender without funding and leaving Ton without ownership.
What happened to it?
All that money, it burn it.
After those 2 rounds of investments, Ton was left with only 10% of Blender's shares, the rest being owned by private investors. Ton was out of money, out of shares, and out of luck.
So the investors called me in, said, Tom, we're going to stop this, and we're going to put your Blender in a drawer here and lock it up, and you can better do something else.
But in May of 2002, he decided to throw a Hail Mary. Even though Blender had not been on the market very long, it had managed to accumulate 250,000 users. So Ton started a non-profit, the Blender Foundation, in an effort to get the community to help him buy back Blender from the investors. His goal was to raise $100,000, which would give him the equity he needed to release Blender as open source. Over the next 7 weeks, $125,000 was donated, which after the fall of Not a Number was enough to entirely buy back Blender. At this point, Ton could have charged for Blender. He had 250,000 users and full equity restored, enough to easily make him a millionaire. But he didn't. Instead, he did two things that even to this day ensure Blender will never cost money. He released Blender under the GPL open source license and organized the Blender Foundation as a Dutch stichting. He knew that while he was chairman and CEO, he would never allow Blender to become paid. But with these two actions, he ensured that no matter what happened to him, Blender would be free forever. So first, let's explore how the GPL works. The Free Software Foundation says, free software is referring to freedom, not price. Our GPLs are designed to make sure that you have the freedom to distribute copies of free software and charge for them if you wish. So legally, Blender could charge for updates. There's nothing stopping them. But under the licensing, anyone can distribute Blender. So hypothetically, let's say Blender charges $100 per month for their new update. So I get out my wallet and pay the $100, and now I'm the proud owner of Blender 4.5. Next month, Blender asks for another $100. But under the GPL, I own the source code. It's not like they can take it away from me. In fact, I can redistribute Blender 4.5. So I open my own site where people can download it for free. And it's perfectly legal because it's a free software under the GPL. I have the freedom to do whatever I want with it. So when Ton set up the general public license, he knew that Blender would remain free forever.
You publish it as open source. Under the most strict license, the GNU GPL is considered to be a very extreme license that only allows software to stay free. So that's why Blender is always free. It has to be free forever. That's in the license. That's how this system works.
But in case that wasn't enough, he set up the Blender Foundation as a Dutch stichting, basically a non-profit, which means the Blender Foundation is legally mandated to reinvest any profit back into Blender. With the system, there are no owners or shareholders, which is a safeguard against corruption. If Blender were for profit, all donations would be considered revenue, meaning if Blender had a surplus, that could be redistributed to the investors as profit. So even though Ton stood to make millions of dollars as the primary shareholder, he chose to set up the Blender Foundation in a way to prioritize the users rather than himself, which is kind of crazy. Imagine spending thousands of dollars on hardware, countless hours in development, taking huge risks with investments, and ending up losing it all, only to buy back Blender from the investors. And after all of that stress, all of that work, setting it up in a way that makes you virtually no money outside of donations. But he could have easily made tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Before researching this video, I obviously respected Ton, but I had no idea what he really did.
But I was never interested in money. Money doesn't mean anything. It's not interesting. I call myself a maker. I want to make stuff. That's my passion. And the money is a means. But the real satisfaction is in making something.
With this in mind, the GPL and stichting aren't important. Blender was never about the money. And Ton has surrounded himself with like-minded people who need to make a living, yes, but ultimately want to make something real, something that makes a difference. And Blender is that thing. Now, this is a very idealized way of looking at Blender. At the end of the day, Blender still needs to generate revenue to operate, and they've chosen to do that through donations to the Blender Foundation. This year, the goal was to raise the donation rate from 0.3 to 2%. So if you're making money with Blender and haven't given back, I would encourage you to donate a small percentage of what you earn, which helps to empower the developers and artists who are making Blender possible. If you've gotten to this point in the video, it's likely that you're a maker too. You want to create something that makes a difference. And at least for me, I'm always trying to learn new skills and grow as an artist, which is why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Brilliant. Because learning new skills is difficult. Discipline and time are two things that are hard to come by. But Brilliant makes the learning process easy. It's not completely effortless, but they provide you with simple, digestible lessons for you to complete every day. Personally, I've always wanted to learn Python, but I had no idea how it worked or where to start. But within my first day, I understood how it worked, and continued to build my skill set from there. Brilliant is where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in math, data analysis, programming, and AI. It's a perfect way to pass the time instead of mindless scrolling, because you can learn anywhere, right on your phone. If you use my link in the description, you'll get a 30-day free trial and 20% off an annual subscription. Thank you, Brilliant, for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching.